This is TWiT.
And so Amanda is going to introduce her story of the week, and I think do a little bit of bragging. And I am very much looking forward to that. So Amanda, without further ado, tell us where you've been, what you've been up to.
Yeah, so last week I went to DC to go to the White House, where there was the first ever White House Creator Economy Conference, which that's just kind of wild that the White House is having a conference for social media creators and influencers. And it was quite an interesting time. So I wrote an article about the experience of going to this conference, and President Biden made a surprise appearance, which I guess...
Wait, that wasn't even planned?
No, well, I mean, I guess it was probably planned, but like we didn't know about it until the day of.
Yeah.
I am making the assumption that I guess the presidential schedule is very hectic and last minute, and so we didn't know until they sent us the agenda the day of, and it had a thing that said POTUS drop in, and I was like, excuse me. So our boy Joe showed up, and it was pretty weird. And all the phones fly up, and then he pretends to take a selfie. And yeah, it was interesting. But the conference itself basically was like very focused on mental health, actually, which I thought was surprising. They were talking a lot about like mental health of creators in the space, which I think is probably a conscious move related to the fact that one of Biden's big policy pushes right now is the Kids Online Safety Act, which is a legislation intended to make the internet safer for kids, but people are also concerned about how it could potentially impact anonymity and privacy online. So they did a panel about mental health. They did a panel about AI and creators. And then Biden shows up and pretends to take a selfie with people. But what I thought was particularly interesting about what he was talking about was he was drawing a really specific distinction between creators and traditional media, which was also weird because the way that White House media works is you have the press pool, who's just like all the journalists from all the big outlets who every day the pool rotates and they just kind of follow Biden around and go to the stuff that he's doing. And then there were some journalists, including me, who were there specifically to cover the White House event for the creator economy, which is separate from the press pool. So we weren't in the press pool, but we were standing with the press pool. And President Biden was saying like, you can't trust the media anymore. They're like blowing up stories, and like it sounded very like Trumpian in a way, what he was saying about the media. And then he said, I'm not going to take questions from the press, but I'll take questions from the creators. But then someone in the press pool tried asking a question, and then the press got kicked out. And I didn't leave.
Can we pause for just a second? This is so much more dramatic than I expected it would be.
Yeah, there's drama.
Like they said, what we're going to do today is we're going to do this sort of political statement by having the press and the creators next to each other in the room. And then Biden, you are going to lambast the press. And then you're going to say, I see you there, but I will not look at you. I will not answer your questions. I will only be taking questions from the folks we trust. And then this feels so much like a step back into the royal gallery. Like that's wild. Sorry to interrupt, but like I just have to process that. And the press got kicked out because they asked a question.
Well, I mean, I do think it was a bit. I don't think it was necessarily the most professional thing that this journalist, after being told not to ask a question, like shouts a question at him. But also it's like, what do you expect? Like, I don't know what the norms necessarily are for the press pool on a regular basis. But he specifically was like, I don't want to talk about foreign policy. Like, someone like asked a question about inflation and he was like, it's going, like, I don't remember what he said, but he kind of just gave the generic, like, whatever the latest information about inflation was. But yeah, so the press pool got kicked out, but because the like 5 or 6 journalists that were there covering the creator economy event specifically were not in the press pool, I was just kind of like, I'm gonna stay in the room, and if someone kicks me out, then I'll leave. But no one kicked me out. And then one of the creators asked him what his favorite social media platform is, and he declined to answer. So, I mean, we didn't really get a lot from this creator and Biden Q&A, but
that's what I was going to ask. What questions were being asked? It sounds like not very good ones.
The thing also is that if you have seen Biden speak recently, you will know that he can talk a lot without saying a ton, which, you know, it is what it is. So he did answer the question about what social platform is his favorite by going into like, well, you know, my grandchildren all have different answers. So, you know, one of my grandchildren, she's an artist. I have another grandchild who hopefully will be starting at Penn next year. I have another grandchild who works in environmental policy. And
that's honestly impressive, right?
Yeah, I was like, honestly, like it's so interesting, even just the experience of being in the same room as someone that has so much global power, and then being like, he's just a guy who wants to talk about his grandkids, I guess. But I think, I mean, aside from my own personal experience of, I went to the White House, it was interesting. I think a larger takeaway here is that the government is really paying attention to the role of creators as both like mini media companies, as well as just people with big influence that they want to be swaying. So we're seeing this week now that the DNC is going on in Chicago. And for the first time, there is like a whole large cohort of creators that were invited to cover the DNC. And even in that case, it's really interesting because the credential process is different for journalists as opposed to creators, which this was sort of something we were thinking about at the conference too, where like, people who work for outlets like on a salary were in the press area, but then there were creators that were invited that are doing journalism. They're just doing it on an independent basis that were on the creator side of things. And I think that we're kind of in a weird time of media right now where we have all these tech companies like Substack, Beehive, and then also the traditional social platforms that are making it possible for people to do journalism professionally and not be tied to a traditional media outlet. But then societally, we're not seeing them necessarily as journalists. And that divide is very interesting to me, especially as it pertains to like political coverage. And simultaneously, on one hand, I think more people having the opportunity to be in media is good, because traditionally the people that are able to get jobs in media are not always like the most diverse set of people. And I think the more voices out there, the better. On the other hand, like, are creators going to be fact checking as rigorously as journalists? I mean, depends on the people, but interesting trend happening here. And Biden loves his grandkids, I learned.
I think it's, I guess I was not expecting, because they talk about it being the creator economy, right? This was a creator economy event. And to take the time to instead kind of talk about mental health. And then for you, it was clear that the reason why was because of the legislation that's being kind of worked through right now. Did anyone have anything to say about that? Because I think that alone, if no one did, draws a clear distinction between journalists like yourself and the creators who maybe are not thinking about all of the angles. And it does, like, I understand that there's trust in these creators and trust in these influencers, but I hate to sound like old men shouting at a cloud. In some ways that could be scary, because I think things can get lost. Do you feel like, well, I'd love to have the answer to if anyone kind of noticed that outside of those of you who were there to cover that aspect of it, but also who were the creators that were there? Were they creators that were making political content? Were they creators that were making, beauty content? And this is not, to be clear, this is not me saying that one is better than the other.
Mhm.
It is simply me kind of trying to understand the folks who get access to these events and what that means in terms of what the goal was.
Yeah, it was an interesting mix of it wasn't only creators, it was about 100 people. I don't know the exact divide, but some of the people there were like startup execs or like people involved in the business of the creator economy. But then among the creators that were there were some political creators, but there were also like makeup creators and like just lifestyle, mental health focused creators. There was someone that makes videos about how to do your taxes. There was someone that makes videos about racial inequity in healthcare. Like, it was a pretty wide-ranging crew, but I think that was something that was interesting to me too, was that on these panels, it was either White House officials interviewing the creators or vice versa. And I think that it's not necessarily like part of the job description for a beauty creator to know about politics. So then you end up in a situation where they're kind of just like excited to be there and they are being told very specific things to say. Like, I do know for a fact that like behind the scenes, they are talking to these creators and like planning out the conversations, not necessarily like scripting it like in an inauthentic way, but it's pretty commonplace for big conferences like this, let alone at the White House, that you have pre-interviews before you go on stage and you discuss what you're going to talk about on stage before you go on stage in a lot of cases. And I did talk to one of the creators that was on stage and they said, yes, like ahead of time, we talked about what to talk about. So, I mean,
and that's not atypical, right? I mean,
I mean, that's
that at these conferences, it's pretty typical.
Yeah, like
but
it's expected.
It's expected, but it does, I think, sometimes get lost that is the case, and so it's good to have that knowledge and that understanding.
And I think especially with like for journalists in particular, like we know that we are allowed to ask questions. The professional relationship is specifically arranged such that like we don't have a sort of like financial relationship necessarily, like, whereas I think sometimes with creators it is not the same. Like, I'm sure some of these creators were like paid to be flied out. I mean, I honestly don't know in this case. I'm just like conjecturing, but I think they just don't know as much like what sorts of things you are and aren't allowed to do in an interview. So if the White House is telling them like, these are the questions we want you to ask, then they're more likely to be like, okay, sure. Whereas I think a journalist would be more likely to be like, well, there's nothing contractually preventing me from asking another question. And if I have the opportunity to interview people in government, maybe I want to know more about like things that maybe they aren't trying to tell us, but you want to find out.
Absolutely. And it makes me think of the recent coverage on Google's phones and the Team Pixel stuff, and how for influencers, there is often a whether it's spoken or unspoken, because sometimes it's unspoken, understanding that to maintain access, one must say positive things about the stuff that they're covering. And so if you have that mindset going into it, you may not think about how you are able to ask questions that would maybe get a journalist kicked out of the room. Although I know in this case, they asked a dumb question, but yeah, I think that's something to be mindful of. Now, We are running out of time for this first topic. Is there anything else that you want to say about your time at the White House before we move along?
I just think that it sort of was a concrete representation of how the tides are turning in looking at creators like they are doing a real job, because they are doing a real job. This is a very fast growing sector. It's very easy to discredit and be like, oh, they're just on TikTok making dancing videos. But these are people building small media businesses. Sometimes they are creating products out of those media businesses. And I don't think that in 5 years, we're going to be like, wasn't it so weird that there was a creator economy conference? It's going to be like, well, yeah, I mean, the White House has science fairs at the White House. Like, why not creator economy conferences?
Absolutely.